So with Age of Ultron issue number 8, we get this really cool story where we learn what it was that had happened after the death of Hank Pym that had caused this reality to take place. Now, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with the idea of branch universe theory in Marvel Comics and in comic books as a whole, I would advise you guys to either go back and watch my video on how alternate realities function, or to go watch Benny's video on alternate realities and how they form within both DC and Marvel, because that's going to be pretty important for you guys to understand in order to really be able to get a good grasp on how this works. But what we see as we start this issue with is that Tony Stark has taken the memories of both Wolverine and Susan Storm and converted them into images, something that he can physically look at. Now, we don't know, for example, how he's able to do this, but what we do know is that whatever technology is being used by him at this time is far more advanced than the technology that exists in the normal Earth 616 universe, indicating to us that perhaps something took place whereby technology had to be sped up. But what we see going on is that while Tony Stark is analyzing these memories, he's not necessarily analyzing them on his own. Of course, he's using Jarvis, but he's also made these memories in the form of images because he's enlisted the aid of Emma Frost and Professor Charles Xavier. And what this tells us is that both of these individuals exist within this alternate reality. Now, of course, Emma Frost and Charles Xavier were largely tied to the X-Men, but we don't know if the X-Men even exist at this point. Of course, we know that Cyclops, who is using the codename Cable, is part of the Defenders, which tells us that perhaps the X-Men maybe fell apart, they went away, or perhaps they were never even formed by Professor Charles Xavier and Emma Frost. All we know is that at this point, they've more or less just come together to work for Tony Stark. And what Tony Stark asks them is whether or not these memories could have been duplicated, whether or not they could have been falsely implanted, perhaps by Morgana Le Fay. Now, Morgana Le Fay, again, is a villain that we haven't got to yet in our discussions on this YouTube channel. But for those of you guys who are familiar with comic book villains, you know that Morgana Le Fay is not necessarily a major villain in the sense that she goes against a wide array of different teams, the X-Men, the Avengers, and so on. She's largely a villain of Doctor Doom, of the Defenders, and of Spider-Woman. But for this story, Marvel's elevated her to a major villain. But what we see Emma Frost and Charles Xavier saying is that even if Morgana Le Fay somehow had a hand in this, there's no possible way she could have implanted these memories into the minds of Susan Storm and Wolverine and allowed them to see two different things at the same time and interpret them different ways. That it's just not possible. And that if she does have that kind of magic, if she does have that kind of power at her disposal, then perhaps she's far more powerful than any of them had previously thought. But again, Tony Stark's a little reluctant here. Tony Stark's a little hesitant to believe that they come from an alternate reality. But if that's the case, if they do come from an alternate reality, if they do hail from a different dimension, and that Wolverine or Susan Storm or somebody had done something to alter the course of reality, then as far as Tony Stark is concerned, they've somehow managed to break time. And so again, the idea here is that the alternate version of Wolverine wants to interrogate the normal version of Wolverine. And Tony Stark says no. Tony Stark says this is not going to happen. Not only that, he also tells Xavier to send the Defenders away, which tells us that maybe there's trouble in paradise here, that things are not necessarily on a solid foundation between the Defenders and Tony Stark, that maybe there's an uneasy alliance here, that perhaps they were even coerced into undertaking this role. In addition, Emma Frost asked the question as to whether or not she should wipe the memories of this current event from the minds of the Defenders. And what Charles Xavier does here is he indicates to us that while this is an alternate reality, that his mindset and his belief systems still remain the same, in the fact that he tells Emma Frost that he doesn't like that kind of abuse of power. He doesn't like people using their powers to manipulate the minds of others or to use their powers on others against their will. And so what Tony Stark does is he tells Jarvis to pull up the security footage from Hank Pym's murder. From here, we switch to Wolverine, and Wolverine's being interrogated by Tony Stark. So presumably, this takes place perhaps some time after Tony Stark had looked at the footage. And what Tony Stark tells Wolverine is that for the longest time, they had believed that Hank Pym had been murdered by a Skrull. In addition, Wolverine asks Tony Stark what it is that happened to him, why it is that half his body is gone, and what Tony Stark says is that at some point in the past, after the death of Hank Pym, that the Avengers had split apart, that there was a war between Latveria, the home of Doctor Doom, and Asgard, the home of Thor, but that after this conflict, after this war had taken place, that Thor had vanished and that he hadn't been seen since. In addition, we learned that Morgana Le Fay has conquered half of the world and most of Europe, indicating that whatever kind of forces she has must be forces of incredible magnitude. What we also find out is that the Avengers had broken up after the death of Hank Pym, and that magic had somehow won over technology, and that Asgard, in addition to Thor, had turned their back on the planet Earth entirely. And so, as Tony Stark puts it, Wolverine had completely and totally broken the world by the actions, or by committing the action of killing Hank Pym. From here, we transition to Susan Storm, and Susan Storm is being held in some kind of giant square room, and she doesn't really know where she is. She's trying to call for someone to come in and talk to her, but nobody answers. And so what she does is she uses her powers to create force fields to somehow make a force field within the handcuffs that are used to bind her hands. And by using her force field, she's able to destroy these restraints and able to escape. At this point, we switch back to Wolverine, and Wolverine asks again what it is that's going on here, if he's under arrest, if he's allowed to go. But what Tony Stark asks Wolverine is if he knows what the butterfly effect is. Does he know what it means when one act takes place that influences a multitude of other acts? And what Wolverine says is that he doesn't think he did anything wrong here, that Hank Pym created a robot, and because he created Ultron, that the world had been left to burn. And so for him, he'd done the right thing here. But Tony Stark combats this by saying that it wasn't necessarily a robot, that it was artificial intelligence. It was a singular mind that was designed to capitalize on its own intelligence and to continually improve itself. And he asked Wolverine if he ever did anything to try to talk Hank Pym out of this, if he ever tried to get him to see the error of his ways. And Wolverine says that he tried, but inevitably he knew that it would have failed. And the reason why is because for people like Hank Pym and Tony Stark and Reed Richards, that is some kind of a religion, that once they realize they can do something, that they can somehow engage into a new foray of technology, that they have to do it, that they can't not do it. And so he felt as though, again, killing Hank Pym was his only option. And so Tony Stark looks at Wolverine and asks him if he believes he's some kind of a selfless hero, that he somehow saved the world. And of course, Wolverine says that he's not necessarily proud of it, but that he thinks he did the right thing. And Tony Stark says that if Wolverine believes that this current reality is better than the one that Wolverine came from, then Wolverine is a fool. And what this means for the most part, as far as our interpretation goes, is that even if Ultron had somehow managed to eradicate the past, even if somehow he'd managed to eliminate all these forces in the timeline that Wolverine had came from when they jumped into the past, that there was still the possibility that Ultron could have been stopped. There was still the possibility they could have done something to change things. But with this reality, it seems as though the world is on the brink of its self-destruction, and so there's really no way to get out of this circumstance. From here, we transition to one of the helicarriers, along with Colonel America, Jan Van Dyne, and others. And for the most part, again, the Defenders have band together because they want to know what it is that's taking place. They want to know what's going on here, indicating that, of course, the Defenders are being kept in the dark by the forces of Tony Stark and various other individuals, and they're not necessarily privy to the kind of information that would normally be done in the normal reality when we would see that the Avengers would share information with S.H.I.E.L.D. In addition, Emma Frost arrives here, and Emma Frost tells the Defenders that they've been ordered to go back to their R&R, to their rest and relaxation time, or to do whatever it is that they do when they haven't been called on for a mission. But what we see is that, for the most part, I guess the thing, Ben Grimm wants to know what's going on with Susan Storm. He wants to know why it is that Susan Storm is here. He wants to know why it is that presumably she's alive, if it is the real her. And again, as far as Wolverine was able to detect using his senses, it was in fact the real Susan Storm, and so Ben Grimm is very confused here. In addition, the Defenders are very upset at the fact that for the most part they're being left in the dark, that they're being held out on information that they consider to be important. And so what Ben Grimm does is he initially goes and passes by Emma Frost and attempts to enter the helicarrier to find out what's taking place. But Emma Frost tries to grab him and stop him and tell him that if he keeps moving and doing what he's doing, that she's going to revert his mind back to a primitive state. From here, Doctor Strange, who appears to be the leader of the Defenders, steps in and says that if Emma Frost does anything like that he'll use his powers on her, that she's never to touch a member of the Defenders. And given the fact that she's displayed such an arrogance against one of his members, one of the members of the Defenders, he tells the Thing, Ben Grimm, that he's okay with his choice, and that Ben Grimm can now undergo the task of trying to find out what's going on with Susan Storm. At this point, we transition back to Iron Man and to Wolverine, and again, Tony Stark is continuing to interrogate Wolverine. And what he does here is he tells Wolverine there was another choice that could have been made here. There was a third decision. Wolverine had a multitude of opportunities in front of him, but he didn't think of the most rational one. He simply just thought of the only thing that he knew, which was to kill Hank Pym. What Tony Stark says is that Wolverine could have told Hank Pym about what was going to happen, and they could have devised a time-release virus. That this virus, at the right moment, could have been activated by Hank Pym and could have been used to kill Ultron. But instead, Wolverine decided to kill Hank Pym. What we also see is that while this interrogation is taking place, that the Thing, Ben Grimm, and the remainder of the Defenders are breaking into the helicarrier and trying to find Susan Storm. And so for the most part, we see these two situations going on at the same time. We see that Tony Stark is for the most part chastising Wolverine over the fact that he broke time. That time is not some kind of absolute construct, that it's not some kind of absolute thing. That time has ramifications, that manipulating time, that messing with time can cause a lot more problems than people had initially thought. And as we transition back to the Thing, Ben Grimm, we see that, of course, they appear to be able to break into the holding cell containing Susan Storm. At this point, because the holding cell has been broken, I guess Jarvis comes in and tells Tony Stark that they're under lockdown. And Tony Stark begins to realize, or begins to believe, that maybe this is, again, some kind of trick by Morgana Le Fay. And Wolverine is surprised to see that Morgana Le Fay is even in the discussion here, that Morgana Le Fay is considered a threat by anybody. And as the door, I guess as the Defenders hover around the door and begin to break into it, when they get in, they realize that the room is empty. But Wolverine says that Susan Storm was just here, that her scent is very, very strong. At this point, the door slams shut behind them, and what we learn is that Susan Storm was in the room when they had first entered, but she had made herself invisible, and she had taken the opportunity, their surprise at believing she was gone, to sneak out and then shut the door behind her, effectively leaving Cyclops, the Thing, and Wolverine trapped inside of this room. From here, we again transition back to Tony Stark, and Tony Stark has left the interrogation room of Wolverine and is now pursuing Susan Storm. And again, while he doesn't necessarily believe this may be a attempt by Morgana Le Fay to infiltrate S.H.I.E.L.D. or to infiltrate what passes for S.H.I.E.L.D. in this alternate reality, he does believe that Susan Storm doesn't need to be there. And so the Defenders go to the aid of Susan Storm to a degree, but Tony Stark is also attempting to kill Susan Storm. But before anybody can really do anything in terms of their defense of either against or for Susan Storm, there's a massive flash of light in the sky. And as the light begins to dissipate, as things begin to come into clarity, we learn that out of this portal in the sky come the forces of Morgana Le Fay, along with an entire host of Doombots. At this point, the Defenders jump into action, and the Defenders do what they can to try to hold off the forces of Morgana Le Fay. But again, for the most part, they are absolutely helpless against such overwhelming odds. But again, we see that we transition back and forth between both the Thing, Ben Grimm, Cyclops, and Wolverine as they're trapped in the room, Tony Stark as he's trying to kill Susan Storm, as well as the Defenders who are fighting out in the open against the Doombots. And Tony Stark, once he arrives, demands that all of the drones at his disposal be used to combat the forces of Morgana Le Fay. And so for the most part, he's abandoned this attempt to kill Susan Storm and is trying to keep Morgana Le Fay from conquering this entire area. Again, we see that the Defenders are trying to do what they can to hold her off, but for the most part, they're unsuccessful here due to the fact that the Doombots that she has at her disposal are magically enchanted, given her ability to manipulate magic and sorcery, but also because there's just so many of them. And so as Tony Stark is battling Morgana Le Fay, he tells her that he thought it was a very interesting trick that she had attempted to have a clone or perhaps some kind of copy of Wolverine and Susan Storm enter the helicarrier and attempt to subvert them from within. But Morgana Le Fay says she doesn't know what he's talking about, that she has no idea what it is that he means when he says this, but tells him to turn around. And when Tony Stark turns around, he realizes that two of the helicarriers are crashing into one another and themselves crashing into New York City below. From here, we're going to bring this story to an end, and in the next issue, we'll see what happens with the fallout of this conflict when both of these helicarriers are crashing into the city, as well as what presumably happens between the normal and the alternate versions of Wolverine, and how everything appears to possibly go back to normal. With that being said, we're going to bring this video to an end, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.